going into the next one, I kind of always felt that way about high carb diets as well. It's like, man, but every really, really lean bodybuilder I know and every great physique athlete I know, male and female, every freakish athlete, they tend to eat a lot of carbs and they don't eat a ton of fats. It's like a very common denominator. And then there was like the outliers that tried to like speak up and hype the keto diet. And we have enough studies now with keto and performance to show that it's just not probably not the best thing. But I've always felt like that, like with high carbs. It's no, even just like bodybuilders in the 90s and early 2000s, all protein and carbs, you know? So, which it leads us into the next one. The next question that he's going to be answering with some research is it harder for the body to store carbs as fat than it is to store fat as fat?
Yeah, great execution on reading that question, because the first time I read it, I was like, wait, what? So this is a good problem to have, right? Because the only reason you should be storing things as fat is if you're in a surplus, right? So at maintenance, this is not something you really need to worry about. So then it's like, okay, now if I want to eat a lot of food, or do I want to eat a little bit extra food? That's the other kind of indicator here. So the research basically says that carbs are not converted to adipose tissue. So I'll use adipose as like body fat, um, as easily as fat is converted to adipose tissue, which kind of makes sense, right? Like carbs have to go through de novo lipogenesis, which is not super efficient. So you have to move some carbons around. You have to go through a couple different pathways. And then fats can just kind of go through the body, be stored, and they're good to go. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially, there's some percentage lost, and that percentage is about 10 to 15%. So, with that practically, if you ate 100 carbs and that was your surplus versus 100 carbs versus 100 fat, calorically equated, not grams.
Over your maintenance, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So basically, you eat 100 extra calories of fat or of carbs. There we go. Good enough.
It's better.
I'm struggling today. Um, 75 to 80% of those carbs are going to be stored as fat, whereas 90 to 95% of that fat is going to be stored as fat. So there's like a 10 to 15% trade-off there, meaning that fat is more easily stored. And there's only one study, maybe two on that. There's an older study from the 80s, and then I linked in the blog. One of my favorite studies is an overfeeding study by Horton. I think it's from '95 or something. But they basically overfed people by 50%, which is a lot, for 2 weeks, and figured this ratio out, where it's 75 to 85% for carbs and 90 to 95% for fat storage. So it's kind of short and sweet, honestly. I think I prefer carbs, but there's always like you have to be careful and make sure you get your healthy fats in. And um, in our physique and bodybuilding review that I wrote with Holmes and Trexler and Fitch, and we went back and forth on it quite a bit, trying to figure out like what's the lower level of fat that we would really use, and it's about 20% of your calories, or about 1 gram, or like 0.5 to 0.75 grams per kilogram of body weight. Um, and I
Which is
don't know.
pretty low.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty low. Um, like it's for a 2,200 calorie diet, that's like 40 to 50 grams of fat. Um,
Yeah. For my body weight right now, because I base it off like when I'm going to deficit, I prefer higher carbs too. And so like I look at like, okay, I can't go past this point, with that. And for where I'm sitting at, right about 170, I weighed in at 168 point something today, but it's like 38 grams of fat is like the low end, which people would be like, what? It's funny because I posted my macros for physique update on my story, and I had so many people were like, how are you surviving on that low fat? Like, are you worried? And I'm like, I'm not worried. I mean, nothing's gonna happen. I'm just eating more carbs. I could bring up my fats, but then I'd have to get rid of carbs, and I just enjoy carbs. But I think this is good because it is short and sweet. But I do have like I'll let you finish if there's more, but I definitely have some like follow-up questions that I think you'll have more theoretical answers for, because I don't think you're going to have a study to answer them. But I'll let you finish first. Is there anything else with this study that you want to kind of make sure you hammer home before I start picking your brain?
No, again, I think that like, so the one other thing that I found while I was doing my research is basically like the type of carbs don't seem to make a difference, whether it's glucose or sucrose. So that's kind of just nice to know. Like, there's no, if you split out your carbs, you're taking in maybe like some fruits or some, more processed carbs. It doesn't really matter.
Is there a mechanism for being able to store fruit as muscle glycogen? The only reason I ask that, because for a while, and you probably heard this back in the day, where it's like they literally had it, and I don't think you can do this for everybody, but they literally had it down to a point where like you can store, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, 450 grams of muscle glycogen, and you can only store 150 grams of liver glycogen, which is fructose. And so you actually like had this like maximum capacity, they believed. And I remember reading that in school. And at the time, I was just like, oh, that's the fucking rule for everybody. But, later on, I realized like, well, I'm sure everybody has different amount of muscle glycogen and storage, and everybody has probably different size liver. So, you know, um,
Yeah.
but like you're saying, it doesn't matter. Is there a conversion process where once your liver glycogen is good to go, it starts using fruit, it's just less efficient, or?
Okay, so if we look at the kind of glycolysis pathway, um, glucose and fructose, so glucose and fructose are kind of at different points, but they end up in the same place. So it doesn't really matter. People used to think because fructose actually inserts lower on the glycolysis chain than glucose does, used to think that like fructose was worse off because it got processed differently, and it took less energy to process. But it doesn't seem to matter that much. So basically, when you break down carbs, right, you break them down into glucose in the blood. You either use them or you store them as glycogen, right? So you weren't too far off actually with your glycogen numbers. I think the liver, it ranges again by size, but 100 to 250 grams of glycogen, let's say, depending on the size of the person. The muscle, like you have a lot of muscle in your body, right? Um, 300 to 500 grams of glycogen. Um, Basically, if you sum those two, it's generally like 400 to 600 or 700 grams of glycogen can be stored. Now, there is an effect where if you overfeed, you can actually store more glycogen than that for a short period of time. Um, but it's kind of not, there's not a lot of science behind it. If you look at the old school endurance runners, they used to deplete and then carb load,
Right.
right, to get more carbs. So it's essentially doing that, but they found out that you don't actually need to deplete to carb load. You can just carb load and glycogen load.
That makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, it does. I worked during my postdoc with an exercise physiologist who she was an endurance athlete, and I was like, a bodybuilder, and so we just knew like completely different things. And yeah, we were talking one day. She's like, "Yeah, that's not really true anymore." I was like, "Oh, okay, huh." It's like, good thing I don't have to do that.
Yeah, no shit. Um, okay, so my first question then, theoretically speaking, is this a based on knowing that 75 to 85% versus 90 to 95%, being 75 to 85% of carbohydrates are being utilized, correct? Versus 90 to 95.
Stored. Yeah,
I'm sorry,
stored. There you
stored. Sorry. So is this giving credit or a reason to do like kind of like I mean, I remember 3DMJ was the first one I remember being like really for this with like a gaining phase, but going with like, hey, let's go with actually like a pretty damn small surplus and just being patient, because physiologically speaking, your body can only build so much muscle, and eating more carbs isn't going to build more muscle. You have to do the work, and if you get enough carbs to support what you're doing, that's enough. But like, does this kind of support that small surplus? Because in my mind, like in this, they're pushing that surplus quite a bit to see what the difference is between what's burned and what's stored, versus like, okay, well, if we know this percentage now, can we just basically go into a small surplus knowing that all that is going to be used to help grow and build muscle and store it as glycogen, and then you don't store fat. It kind of gives credit to the idea of an actual lean gaining phase. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
so a little bit. I think it's hard to compare just the amount of caloric surplus, right? 50%, like if you're eating 2,000 calories a day and then you go to 3,000, like that's a big difference. And this study that I link in there, they weren't exercising. So that adds a whole nother component on it. And so
Oh
we
yeah.
are, I'm part of a study with Helms and Figure and a couple other people who were doing an overfeeding study with two different, like a lower amount and then a larger amount, and to try to see like what's optimal. Um, and because of COVID, that's like so far pushed back. But I think in the grand scheme of things, uh, going with a lower surplus is safer. It's better. It will have you dieting on the back end less, which is good, right? And you mentioned you can only gain so much muscle at a time. We don't even know what that is, but it is very minimal.
Because and I agree, and I think that makes sense. And obviously, the training factor plays a huge role. But in my mind, it's like if we had a large surplus and a small surplus, what I would think would happen is both groups, if the training program's the same, protein's the same, all that, I would assume both groups would build the same amount of lean tissue, so the same amount of muscle. One group would gain more fat. Um, I think the main problem is long term practically, and this is the only argument I've heard on the side of going faster and it making sense, is the patience factor. For some people, if they don't see the scale moving or if they don't feel their shirt getting tighter around their shoulders and arms, they don't feel like they're doing anything, and it's just demotivating, to not grow, to know like, hey, we're gonna go slow, but your gaining phase is gonna take a year, and I did that like just recently, not that long ago, like 2020. And it takes a lot of patience. It is definitely harder than going, you know what, I'm just gonna fucking get after it and grow. Um, but again, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to do a pretty well done study and a good size like length study to really see. Because a lot of times, I know even for me, I gain quick at first, and then it kind of slows down regardless of how big of a surplus I'm in anyway. Um, so it'd be interesting to see. But
Yeah.
to me, that was the first thing that came up. And the second thing was like in fat loss. Okay, we're not at maintenance. We're not going to surplus. Does this give credit to say that we could potentially diet on more calories? I might be fishing here, but diet on more calories if we're on a higher carb approach because that process is less likely to store as fat. So if we create the deficit primarily through fat, we're going to be burning a lot of the carbs we're taking in anyway, and we're going to be using the little bit of fat we have. Does that make any sense at all? Is there anything to show value in that?
So no, but there are other studies that show if you eat more carbs, you generally move more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now, and we have a neat question next, but um, that kind of gives credence to, okay, let's eat a little more carbs because you're going to move around a little more, you're going to feel a little better, you're going to train a little bit better. Um, but in terms of the transitionary or the ratios with adipose and fat and carbs, I don't think it really matters because you're not storing any of it, hopefully.
Mm.
Now,
Gives me a deficit.
yeah, and maybe like again, this does uh, give you the idea that when you refeed or when you diet break, that you should probably use carbs. So if you go over, it's not 95% stored as adipose, right? And you should go over with carbs. So
Yeah.
maybe you don't, like, you get to eat more, but you don't store as much if you accidentally, oops, ate extra 300 calories or something, right?
Yeah. And that's also credence to say that like you probably don't need those refeeds or diet breaks as often as people like to think. Because if you were pretty depleted when you finally took that, it would probably take a lot before you got to start worrying about that percentage of storage anyway, because you got to refill your glycogen, and that could be a good amount of carbs. It might be all the carbs you take on a refeed, but a lot of people think they need a refeed every week or every other week. And a lot of times I see better results with people when they actually wait quite a bit of time. Obviously, there's a psychological reason. If somebody's hurting, I'm going to give it to them. But like the more research that's come out on diet breaks and refeeds, the more like sparing I give them, and it just tends to work better as long as they don't need it psychologically. I don't think there's any harm in doing that. Um, the reason I asked that question though about fat loss was because I interviewed not too long ago Dr. Joe Klemczynski, really good podcast, but he brought up a study on basically like high fat, low carb, and then high carb, low fat, calories equated fat loss study in the group with high carbs, low fat, lost more body fat in the process. Um, and one of my first thoughts was this whole idea of de novo lipogenesis just being a more taxing and time consuming process. So the body may be stored less, but being that they were all in a deficit, it probably is what you said. They probably just burned more calories during the study because they had more energy.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, I don't think anybody's ever other. Yeah, it's just so hard to see through the straight deficit.
Mhm.
So I don't know if we could actually figure that out.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's semantics, right? Like at the end of the day, if like most people would be like, well, I don't give a shit why. If that's going to help me lose more weight fast, then I'm in, you know? And there is potential for that. But also, if you can't adhere to a lower fat diet, you know, I'm in the middle of a cut right now, and I'm eating 40 grams of fat a day. That's, you know, it's not hard for me to adhere to, but for some people, that's damn near impossible. So you have to consider that. And then the other thing to consider, and I told somebody this in my DM when they were asking me about it, is I have my date night every Saturday, and I'm very loose with what I'm tracking. It's more like calories and just get my protein in. I have plenty of fat on that day. So if we're technically talking on a weekly caloric average or a weekly macro average, I'm consuming way more than 40 grams of fat a day. We went to an Italian restaurant last weekend, and trust me, I ate 3 days worth of fat in a single meal. Like it was, you know, and most people think Italian, they think carbs, but they forget about the cheese, the butter, the oil. Like it's kind of ridiculous. Amazing, but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
there.
and that's why most people have a struggle on a low fat diet is because of all the fat that's hidden everywhere.
Mhm.
Like like even not getting super lean meat, like you're like, oh, lean beef, 85-15 versus 96-4,
Yeah.
right? That's a big difference, like 10 grams of fat per serving. You're like, whoa.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just harder.
Yeah. And the honestly, the key for me is I switch from steak to chicken. Like I
Yeah,
love steak, but when I make that switch, it's so easy to stay low. It's just because with steak, if you want a good steak, you got to have a good amount of fat in there, you know? And it's not that
yeah,
you can't eat steak. I love steak. But when I was like, I need to pull something, all right, dude, let's pull fat because I want my carbs, period.
yeah, for sure.
But, um,